The smell of rising dough is the first memory I have. It's a scent more comforting than any perfume, more honest than any spoken word. It's the smell of life, of potential, of something simple being coaxed into something magnificent. For 10 years, that was the smell of my world. My name is Amelia Reyes, and I was a baker. But I wasn't just a baker, I was the heart and soul of the Rolling Pin, a small sanctuary of flour, sugar, and warmth nestled in the heart of Havenwood. This town, with its white picket fences and ancient oak trees lining Main Street, was the only home I'd ever known, and my bakery was its morning ritual. The rolling pin wasn't just a business I built, it was a promise I kept. A promise to my grandmother, who had left me her worn out rolling pin and a book of recipes scribbled in a spidery, flour dusted hand. She taught me that baking wasn't about measurements, it was about feeling. It was about knowing the exact moment the dough yielded under your palms, the precise shade of gold on a croissant that meant perfection. I poured every penny of my savings, every ounce of my strength, and every fragment of my soul into its walls. I painted them the color of buttermilk, laid the checkered floor tiles myself, and sanded down the old oak countertop until it shone with a soft, welcoming glow. It was more than a bakery. It was my grandmother's legacy and my life's work, all under one roof. And my life, like my baking, seemed to have all the right ingredients. The final, most important one was Daniel Harrison. Daniel was Havenwood's golden boy, a firefighter with a hero's jawline and eyes the color of a calm summer sky. Our love story was the stuff of local legend, the baker and the firefighter. He'd wander in for coffee and a morning bun, his uniform still smelling faintly of smoke, and his smile would light up the entire shop. He represented everything I thought I wanted: safety, strength, a future as solid and dependable as the town itself. We were engaged to be married the following spring, and our future felt as warm and certain as the loaves cooling on my racks. But a perfect recipe can be ruined in an instant. It happened on a Tuesday in October, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The annual Havenwood Fall Festival was just a week away, and I was working late, possessed by a creative fever. I was perfecting a new recipe, a spiced apple and caramel brioche that I hoped would be the star of the festival. The bakery was quiet, the rest of the town asleep under a blanket of stars. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the air, a sweet, comforting perfume. I remember humming to myself, my hands, my most precious tools, moving with a practiced grace, dusting flour across the familiar oak counter. The last thing I remember clearly was sliding a final tray into the big deck oven, the gentle click of the timer, and a profound sense of peace. My life was exactly where it was meant to be. The peace, shattered like glass.
It wasn't the familiar smoky scent of overbaked bread. It was acrid, chemical, and it burned my throat. A thick black smoke began to pour from the back storeroom, impossibly fast, unnaturally aggressive. It wasn't a creeping accidental fire, it was a hungry beast devouring my dream in violent gulps. Panic seized me, the air turned to poison, and the comforting warmth of the ovens was replaced by a blistering, malevolent heat. I stumbled towards the front door, but a wave of heat and smoke threw me back. The floorboards groaned, and the beautiful buttermilk walls began to weep black tears. My world was collapsing into an inferno. Through the roaring flames and the splintering of wood, I heard the sirens, and then a figure in heavy gear smashed through the front window. It was Daniel. His eyes, barely visible behind his mask, found mine through the smoke. He scooped me up, his arms the only solid thing in a world that was turning to ash, and carried me out onto the cold pavement. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the sign I had painted myself, the rolling pin, being swallowed by a furious orange glow, my promise, my legacy, my entire life consumed by fire. I woke up to a world of sterile white and muffled beeps. The smell of antiseptic had replaced the smell of bread. The pain came next. a searing agony that seemed to start in my hands and radiate through my entire body. They were swathed in thick white bandages, two useless clubs at the ends of my arms. A doctor with tired eyes explained the extent of the damage: second and third degree burns across my arms, shoulders, and most devastatingly, my hands. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, a phrase that felt like a cruel joke. What life did I have left? The physical pain was nothing compared to the news that trickled in over the next few days. The bakery was a total loss. Nothing was salvageable. The insurance, it turned out, had a clause I'd overlooked, a fine print technicality about old wiring that meant they wouldn't pay out. I was ruined. But the whispers that followed were what truly broke me. They started with the fire marshal, a grim-faced man who asked questions that felt more like accusations. "Were you tired, Miss Reyes? Is it possible you left a rag near the oven? Were your finances in order?" The whispers slithered out of the investigator's room and into the hospital hallways. I heard them from the nurses, their sympathetic smiles now tinged with something else, pity mixed with suspicion. The story began to form, a narrative that cast me not as a victim, but as the careless author of my own misfortune. "She was always so ambitious," I heard one say, "probably overworked, exhausted."
My defender, the one screaming my innocence from the rooftops. Instead, he just sat there, his silence, a growing, terrifying void. And in that void, a cold dread began to take root in my heart. I hadn't just lost my bakery, I was losing my name, my reputation. And as I looked into the averted eyes of the man I loved, I realized I might be losing him too. The fire had taken my past and my future. Now it seemed it was coming for my present. Recovery is a quiet, brutal war fought within the confines of your own skin. For me, the battlefield was a sterile physical therapy room that smelled of rubbing alcohol and quiet desperation. Each day was a pilgrimage of pain, forcing stiff, scarred fingers to bend, to curl, to remember the simple grace of holding a cup. My therapist, a kind woman named Sarah, would murmur words of encouragement, but they were drowned out by the phantom smell of smoke that clung to me like a shroud. I close my eyes and see the flames, feel the blistering heat on my skin. The burns were healing, leaving behind a patchwork of tight pink scars on my hands and arms, but the wounds inside me only festered. The worst part was the silence from Daniel. He visited less and less, his excuses about long shifts at the firehouse sounding increasingly hollow. The day I was discharged from the hospital, the early winter air felt thin and sharp in my lungs. Daniel was there, his handsome face set in a strained smile. He loaded my small bag into his truck, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. I expected him to drive us home, to the small apartment we had shared, filled with our plans and photos. Instead, he turned down a different street and pulled up in front of the Havenwood Inn, a place for tourists and strangers. "I thought this would be better for you," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Our place, it has too many memories of the bakery. This will be a fresh start." The words were meant to sound considerate, but they felt like an eviction notice. He was already separating his life from the wreckage of mine. He paid for a week in advance, left me with a quick chaste kiss on the forehead, and promised to check in later. I watched his truck drive away, leaving me on the curb like a package delivered to the wrong address. Walking through Havenwood was like walking through a gallery of my own ghosts. The town that had once felt like a warm embrace now met me with the cold shoulder of a stranger. People I had known my whole life, who I'd served coffee and pastries to every morning, would suddenly find something interesting to look at across the street when I approached. Their sympathy had curdled into a quiet, potent judgment. The Havenwood Gazette ran a story with the headline, "Tragedy on Main Street, Questions of Oversight Arise." The article didn't name me directly as the cause, but it didn't have to. It was filled with quotes. I was no longer Amelia Reyes, the beloved baker. I was a cautionary tale. Just when the silence and the judgment became unbearable, a crack of light appeared in my dark world. His name was Frank Peterson. He was a retired fire chief, a legend in the county, and had been a close friend of my grandfather. He showed up at my lonely inn room one afternoon, his old eyes sharp and clear, missing nothing. He didn't offer platitudes or pity. He just sat down and said, "I read the official report on your fire, Amelia. It's a neat little story. Too neat." He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. "I was a firefighter for 40 years. I know what a grease fire looks like. I know what faulty wiring smells like. Your fire, it was too hot too fast. It burned with a rage that doesn't come from an accident. A flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope ignited in my chest. Frank, driven by a loyalty to my family's name, started his own quiet investigation. He spent days sifting through the charred remains of my bakery, long after the official investigators had packed up. A week later, he came back to my room. He didn't say a word. He simply opened a small evidence bag and placed a warped, partially melted piece of metal on the table. "Found this under the floorboards in the back storeroom," he said, "far from any of your ovens or electrical outlets. My friend at the state lab did me a favor. It's a fragment from a canister, traces of a petroleum-based accelerant. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and vile. Accelerant, arson. My fire wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of destruction. Someone had tried to destroy me. My first thought was justice. My second was Daniel. I clutched the evidence bag and stormed out of the inn, my purpose clear. I found him at the firehouse, polishing a truck, the very image of civic duty. I didn't waste time with greetings. I held up the bag. "Frank found this. It was arson, Daniel. Someone burned down my bakery on purpose." I waited for the explosion, the righteous fury of a man whose fiancé was attacked. I waited for him to grab his keys, to march to the sheriff's office, to demand an investigation. Instead, his face went pale. He glanced around nervously, pulling me into an empty office. "Amelia, calm down," he whispered, his voice tight. "Frank is an old man chasing ghosts. You can't trust this." His denial was too quick, too practiced. "This is evidence, Daniel," I insisted, my voice shaking. "We have to show this to someone." "And say what?" he shot back, his calm demeanor cracking. "That a retired chief with a grudge against the new department has a conspiracy theory? It'll just be a spectacle. Think of what that would do to you." "Why are you so determined to let this go?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Why are you not angry?" He ran a hand through his hair, cornered and desperate. "Because this isn't some big conspiracy. It's a tragedy, and reopening it would damage the town's trust in us, in the department, in my family." He said that last part with a raw, pleading desperation that chilled me to the bone. My family. That was it. The missing ingredient. This wasn't about protecting me. It was about protecting the Harrison name. The horrifying truth clicked into place, sharp and brutal. He knew. From the very beginning, he knew it was arson. The man who had carried me from the flames was an accomplice to the crime. His heroism that night wasn't an act of love. It was an act of damage control. He was making sure the person who could expose the truth didn't burn along with the evidence. The strength drained from my legs. I had to lean against the wall to stay upright. The loving fiancé, the town hero, was a liar. He was helping my attacker get away with it. He stepped toward me, his face softening into a mask of pity. "Amelia, please, just let it go. We can move on from this. We can leave Havenwood, start over somewhere new. His offer was poison disguised as a lifeline. He wasn't offering a future, he was offering a gag. He was trying to buy my silence. I looked at my hands, at the scarred, disfigured skin that would never again feel the smooth texture of dough. Those scars were a testament to a crime he was actively concealing. I had lost my dream, my reputation, my financial security. But in that cold, sterile office, I realized I had lost something far more precious. I had lost the man I loved, or rather, I had lost the illusion of the man I thought he was. He was a stranger, and he was my enemy. The question was no longer about a random act of violence. It was about a targeted attack, and the Harrison family was at the very heart of it. In a small town like Havenwood, some families are like the ancient oaks that line Main Street. Their roots run so deep they have become part of the very foundation. You can't build anything, grow anything, or even exist without acknowledging their shade. The Harrisons were Havenwood's oldest, strongest oak. To an outsider, they were the picture of civic virtue and quiet success. But I was no longer an outsider. I was a girl who had gotten too close to the sun and had been burned, and I was beginning to see the rot hidden deep within their roots. The name Harrison didn't just carry weight in our town, it was the gravitational force that held everything in orbit. I had seen the way his calm never wavered, even when his anger was palpable. It was a terrifying stillness, the quiet of a predator. He had a way of looking at you, a slight tilt of his head that made you feel like he was reading the fine print of your soul. Problems in Havenwood had a way of simply disappearing around the judge. A zoning dispute would be quietly resolved. A troublesome journalist would be transferred. He never raised his voice, but his influence was a silent, crushing tide. If the judge was the family's foundation, his wife Eleanor was its elegant, meticulously crafted facade. She was the social architect of Havenwood, the gatekeeper of taste and acceptance. She ran the Historical Society, chaired the annual charity gala, and her opinion on everything from garden roses to local politics was treated as gospel. To be invited to one of Eleanor's dinner parties was to have arrived in Havenwood society. To be excluded was a quiet death sentence. I remember the first time Daniel brought me to meet her. She'd appraised me with a polite, bloodless smile, her eyes scanning my simple dress, my flower dusted fingernails. A baker, she had said, the words hanging in the air. How quaint. She was never overtly cruel, but her kindness was a weapon. She would give me backhanded compliments about how I had done so well for myself, considering, always reminding me that I was a guest in her world, not a resident. Then there was Caroline, Daniel's younger sister. She was the heir apparent not to the judge's legal dynasty, but to the family's real and far more tangible source of power, Harrison Properties. She was sharp, ambitious, and had inherited her mother's social ruthlessness and her father's cold pragmatism. From the beginning, Caroline had viewed me with open disdain. To her, I was an embarrassing detour in her brother's otherwise perfect life trajectory. She saw the rolling pin not as a beloved local business, but as an eyesore, a stubborn little brick and mortar relic standing in the way of progress, her progress. And that's where the pieces finally, horrifyingly, clicked into place. The Harrisons didn't just live in Havenwood, they owned it, or at least they planned to. Caroline was the face of a massive downtown revitalization project, a plan to tear down the old historic storefronts on Main Street and replace and laid out a blueprint on my oak counter. Amelia, she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension. This is your chance to be part of the future instead of a relic of the past. I had politely but firmly told her that my bakery wasn't for sale, that it held a value her money couldn't touch. She had smiled that tight Harrison smile and said, everything has a price. I see it now. My refusal wasn't just a business problem for them, it was an insult. How dare a no name baker stand in the way of their dynasty? The memories flooded back, no longer innocent, but tainted with a sinister new meaning. Eleanor's constant remarks about how drafty and inefficient these old buildings were. Judge Harrison's fatherly advice at a family barbecue, telling me that sometimes progress requires letting go of sentiment. And Daniel, oh Daniel, he had been their most effective weapon. He had framed it as concern for me, for us. Think about it, Ames, he would say, wrapping his arms around me in my flour dusted apron. If you sold, we could build our dream house. You wouldn't have to work these crazy hours. We could finally have a real life. He wasn't wooing me towards a brighter future. He was trying to manipulate me into surrendering my independence. He was the handsome face on their brutal campaign. My love for him had been their leverage, my trust, their tool. The fire wasn't a warning, it was a solution. They didn't just want my property, they wanted to erase me, the girl who had the audacity to say no. They burned down my life's work, and then they orchestrated the narrative to blame me for it, ensuring I would have no credibility, no support, no way to fight back. Daniel's rescue was the most twisted part of the charade. By playing the hero, he controlled the scene, ensuring no one looked too closely at the cause, deflecting all suspicion. He didn't save me from the fire, he delivered me from one prison of flames into another, a prison of lies and isolation, all to protect his family's monstrous ambition. I was completely and utterly alone, trapped in a town that was a gilded cage, and the Harrison family held the key. The realization settled in my bones, cold and heavy as stone. You can't fight an enemy who owns the law, the money, and the hearts of the people. To stay in Havenwood was to accept a slow, silent death. I had to disappear. But as I sat in that cold, lonely inn room, I made a promise to the reflection in the window. A stranger with a haunted face and scarred hands. This was not an ending, it was an intermission. I would leave. The week Daniel paid for at the inn bled into a second week that I paid for with the last of my emergency funds. And then there was nothing. My bank account was a hollow echo of its former self. I packed my few remaining clothes into the trunk of my beat up sedan and checked out of the Havenwood Inn, leaving the last shred of my old life behind. I was officially homeless, a citizen of nowhere. My world had shrunk to the worn fabric seats and foggy windows of a 10-year-old car. For days I became a ghost in my own town. I'd park on quiet side streets, sinking low in my seat whenever a familiar car drove by. I watched Havenwood move on without me, the rhythm of its life uninterrupted by my absence. I saw mothers pushing strollers, their children laughing, on their way to the park where Daniel and I had planned to have our engagement photos taken. I saw the lights of other businesses on Main Street flicker on at dusk, a warm, inviting glow that made the skeletal, boarded up ruin of my bakery look like a gaping wound. One afternoon, I saw Caroline Harrison, dressed in a sharp power suit, standing on the sidewalk in front of my property, pointing and smiling as she spoke to a group of men in hard hats. They were vultures planning to feast on the corpse of my dream. The cold of late autumn began to seep into my bones. I survived on cheap coffee and day-old pastries from a gas station, a cruel parody of my former life. At night, I tried to sleep in the back seat of my car, but sleep rarely came. The fire replayed in my mind on a terrifying loop. But now, the new scene was spliced into the horror. Daniel's face, pale and evasive, as he told me to let it go. The scars on my hands ached constantly, a throbbing reminder not just of the flames, but of the betrayal. I was adrift in a sea of grief, and the shame was a lead weight pulling me under. I had failed. I had lost. I was invisible. Then the final anchor to my old life gave way. I was parked in the lot of the closed-down textile mill on the edge of town when I turned the key in the ignition and was met with a sickening click, followed by silence. The engine was dead. I had no money for a tow truck, no money for a mechanic. This car wasn't just a car. It was my shelter. It looked like a fortress. I felt a surge of self-loathing. What was I doing here? What did I expect? But I couldn't turn back. I crept along the edge of the perfectly manicured lawn, using the massive sculpted hedges as cover, feeling like a thief in the night. The curtains in the judge's ground floor study were open, the room lit by a crackling fireplace, and there they were, the entire family: the judge, Eleanor, Caroline, and Daniel. They were holding champagne flutes, their faces lit with triumph, celebrating. A wave of nausea washed over me. I pressed myself against the cold stone of the house, huddling beneath the large bay window, which was cracked open just enough to let out the sound of their laughter. Caroline's sharp, brittle voice cut through the night. The final permits came through. Demolition on that eyesore begins Monday. Good riddance. Eleanor then turned to Daniel, her smile predatory. You handled the Amelia situation perfectly, darling. So heroic. The town will rally behind you forever after that display. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, a fly caught in the amber of their cruelty. Then I heard the judge's deep, resonant voice raise a toast. To Daniel. He knew what needed to be done from the start, a necessary sacrifice for the family's future. The world tilted on its axis from the start. The words echoed in the hollow space where my heart used to be. And then came the sound that finally, irrevocably shattered me. It was Daniel's laugh. A low, confident chuckle I had never heard before. She was always too sentimental, he said, his voice dripping with a casual contempt that was more violent than any blow. She never would have listened to reason. It was the only way to get her out of the picture for good. He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes catching the firelight. I almost felt bad when I saw her in there trapped, he admitted, and for a split second, a monstrous part of me leaned in, desperate for a sign of remorse. But then, he continued, I thought of us, of what we are building, a small price to pay. It was not a sacrifice he was forced to make. It was a transaction he had willingly signed off on. He hadn't been a pawn. He was a king, sacrificing his queen to win the game. The fire, the rescue, the gentle concern, our entire relationship, it was all a calculated performance in a long con. He hadn't just a I was on the shoulder of a dark highway when the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, melting on my face like tears. Rock bottom wasn't a place. It was the absolute certainty that you had never mattered at all. But as the snow fell, covering me in a blanket of white, a tiny feral spark ignited in the frozen wasteland of my soul. It wasn't hope, it was rage, and it whispered a promise into the howling wind. If they wanted a ghost, I would learn how to become the most terrifying spectre they could ever imagine. Rock bottom has a temperature. It's the icy burn of snowflakes on skin that has lost the will to feel, the crystalline quiet of a world that has given up on you. I lay on the shoulder of that dark highway, a discarded doll in the burgeoning snowstorm, and felt a strange sense of peace. The rage that had briefly flickered was being smothered by the cold. It was so much easier to just let go, to let the white silence cover me completely. The world was fading to a dull grey haze when a pair of headlights cut through the snow, slowing, stopping. A car door opened, and the dome light cast a soft glow on a figure walking toward me. I braced myself for the worst, but the voice that spoke my name was a woman's, sharp and clear and achingly familiar, though I couldn't place it. Amelia? Amelia Race? She helped me to my feet, her grip surprisingly strong. She was older, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat, with silver hair cut in a severe, elegant style. Her eyes, the color of slate, were what held me. They were my mother's eyes, but where my mother's held a gentle melancholy, these were sharp, intelligent, and held a lifetime of storms. She wrapped me in a cashmere blanket from the back seat of her luxury sedan, the warmth a shocking intrusion into my frozen numbness. My name is Evelyn Reed, she said, her voice devoid of pity. I am your mother's sister. Evelyn, the family ghost, the one my mother had spoken of in hushed, bitter tones, the cold, ruthless sister who had cut off the family for money and ambition decades ago. She had gone to California, built some kind of tech empire, and never looked back. She was the monster in our family's fairy tales, and right now she was my savior. She didn't ask questions. She simply drove us to a small private airfield where a sleek jet sat waiting on the tarmac. As we ascended into the stormy sky, leaving the tiny sleeping wound of Havenwood behind, she finally told me her story. She hadn't cut. He had called her just an hour before she found me, telling her I was on foot, heading out of town into a blizzard. She looked at me then, her gaze intense. They took your life, Amelia. They left you to die in the snow. I am offering you a choice. I will give you the resources to build a new life, a better one, and, if you so choose, I will give you the power to systematically dismantle theirs. We landed in San Francisco, a city that glittered with a cold, beautiful indifference. Her home was a penthouse that seemed to float above the fog, a world of glass and steel and breathtaking views of the Golden Gate Bridge. It was the antithesis of my cozy bakery of Havenwood, of everything I had ever known. This was a world of power, and Evelyn was its queen. The first step in my new life was to erase the old one. Evelyn introduced me to a brilliant surgeon, a man who was more artist than doctor. The process was agonizing. Weeks of consultations, followed by a series of painful surgeries to repair the damaged nerves and skin on my hands and arms. He used revolutionary techniques, grafting skin so skillfully that the burn marks faded into faint silvery lines, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. I chose to keep them. They were my own private map of hell, a reminder of the debt that was owed. At my request, the surgeon also made subtle changes to my face, a slightly stronger jawline, a refinement to the bridge of my nose. Nothing drastic, but enough that the woman looking back at me from the mirror was a stranger. Amelia Reyes was beginning to disappear. While my body healed, Evelyn began to reforge my mind. She was a brutal, brilliant mentor. She stripped away my small town sentimentality, teaching me that in the world the Harrisons inhabited, kindness was a weakness and trust was a liability. They see life as a chess game, she told me one night, standing before the glittering city lights. I took control of a small portion of Evelyn's investment portfolio and in 3 years tripled it. I wasn't just playing a part anymore. The rage I had felt that night on the highway had not faded. It had been honed into a tool, a cold, patient energy that fueled my every move. I was no longer the victim. I was the coming storm. One evening, I stood in my office, which occupied the entire top floor of a skyscraper in the financial district. On a massive screen before me was a high resolution satellite image of Havenwood. It looked so small, so fragile from this height. The corner of Main and Elm, where my bakery once stood, now hosted a sleek modern building bearing the Harrison Properties logo. Evelyn walked in, a glass of whiskey in her hand. She stood beside me, following my gaze to the screen. She didn't need to ask what I was thinking. The silence stretched, filled with 5 years of planning, of waiting, of hardening. "Are you ready?" she finally asked, her voice soft. I turned away from the image of my stolen past, my face a calm, unreadable mask. "They say revenge is a dish best served cold," I replied, my voice a low, steady whisper she had never heard before. "I think it's time to preheat the oven. The return is a strange and silent thing. It's not a homecoming, it's an infiltration." 5 years ago, I had stumbled out of Havenwood, a ghost in the snow. Today I glide back in, encased in the tinted privacy of a black Maybach, the engine a deep, confident purr. The crisp autumn air is the same, the golden leaves skittering across the road are the same, but I am not. I am a predator returning to a hunting ground I know by heart. The woman who fled in terror is gone. In her place sits Isabella Rossi, a name forged in silence and funded by a quiet burning rage. My hands, gloved in soft Italian leather, rest calmly in my lap. The faint silvery scars beneath are a secret testament to my purpose. As we drive down Main Street, I see the fruits of their conquest. Havenwood has been given a facelift, but it's the cold, impersonal work of a surgeon who cares for profit, not character. The charming, mismatched storefronts of my memory have been replaced by a uniform row of sterile-looking boutiques and high-end cafes. It's prettier, perhaps, but its soul has been auctioned off. And there, at the corner of Main and Elm, stands the crown jewel of their new empire, the Harrison Center. Have been carefully seeded into the local business community. Rumors of a formidable investor looking for a new ambitious project in a town with untapped potential. I don't just arrive, I descend. I check into the recently opened Havenwood Grand Hotel, the fanciest, most expensive establishment in town, owned and operated, of course, by Harrison Properties. My presence with my quiet entourage and my refusal to give interviews immediately becomes the town's most tantalizing mystery. The first few days are a masterclass in controlled observation. I walk the streets of my former life, a ghost in a Gucci coat. I visit the town square, the library, the park. I see faces I recognize. Mrs. Gable, who always bought my scones, Mr. Henderson, the hardware store owner. They look at me with the polite, deferential curiosity reserved for the wealthy and powerful. They see Isabella Rossi, not the baker girl whose life they watched burn. The completeness of my transformation is both a triumph and a quiet sorrow. To become this powerful woman, I had to completely annihilate the hopeful, trusting girl I once was. There is a loneliness in this kind of power, a chilling isolation that I embrace as armor. The bait is cast with precision. I let it be known through my impeccably professional assistant, Marcus, that Rossi Capital is not interested in more retail or condos. We are looking to fund a legacy project, a major philanthropic investment, a state-of-the-art performing arts center, a full restoration of the historic district the Harrisons had neglected, a scholarship foundation for the children of Havenwood. The plan is designed to be everything the Harrisons project is not. community focused, culturally significant, and altruistic. It's a direct challenge to their soulless commercialism, a lure crafted to appeal to their greed while simultaneously exposing it. They will not be able to resist the opportunity to attach their name to my money and my prestige. It doesn't take long. 2 days after the rumors begin to solidify, the Harrisons make their move. But before they do, my past confronts me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I am standing across the street from their building, my building, when a fire truck pulls up to the station next door. The firefighters get out, their camaraderie easy and familiar, and then I see him, Daniel. He looks older, his face etched with a maturity he didn't have before, but he is still handsome, still the town's golden boy. He is laughing at a joke a colleague made. For a heart-stopping second, our eyes meet across the street. I am prepared for a jolt, a flicker of confusion, any sign that he sees a ghost in my features. There is nothing. Just a brief, polite glance at the well-dressed stranger, and then he turns away. The man who orchestrated my ruin looks at my. The next morning, Marcus informs me that Caroline Harrison is on the line. Her voice, he notes, is a carefully measured blend of professionalism and entitlement. She wishes to formally welcome me to Havenwood and would be honored to host a meeting to discuss potential synergies between our two enterprises. The hook is set. They see me not as an enemy, but as a bigger fish they can swim alongside, a wealthy outsider to be flattered and fleeced. They are walking, with all the arrogance of the untouchable, directly into my carefully constructed parlor. I instruct Marcus to accept her offer, but with a slight modification. Miss Rosie prefers to host, he tells her smoothly. She would be delighted to treat you and your father to dinner, a more intimate setting to discuss the future of this charming town. After a calculated pause, Marcus adds the final critical piece. Ms. Rosie has also heard a great deal about your brother Daniel, the fire chief, a true community hero. She feels it would be invaluable to have his perspective on the town's needs as well. Please extend the invitation to him. The stage is set. The players are being summoned. The first act of my return is about to begin. Not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but across a dinner table, where courtesies are currency and words are weapons. They think they are coming to dinner with an investor. They have no idea they are about to have their last supper with Amelia Reyes. The stage for the first act of my revenge was not a courtroom, but a private dining room at the Gilded Quill, Havenwood's oldest and most respected restaurant. It was one of the few establishments on Main Street the Harrisons didn't own, a relic of quiet, old-world elegance that stood in stark defiance of their glass and steel modernity. The choice was a statement. This was my territory. I had arrived early, taking my seat at the head of the long mahogany table. The room was cast in the warm glow of a fireplace. The silverware gleamed, and the air was thick with the scent of old leather and new possibilities. I was calm, my heart a slow, steady drumbeat against my ribs. I had rehearsed this night in my mind 1,000 times. I was not Amelia, the nervous baker girl. I was Isabella Rosie, and I was here to hunt. They arrived together, a united front of power and privilege. Judge Harrison, with his air of unassailable authority, Caroline, chic and sharp in a designer suit, her eyes immediately scanning the room, assessing me, and Daniel. He looked out of place in his tailored suit, the fabric pulling slightly across his broad firefighter's shoulders. He was the hero forced into a courtier's costume. It's a pleasure to finally meet the man who keeps this town safe. My smile was flawless. My eyes were ice. The opening act was a delicate dance of pleasantries. They probed, I parried. They complimented my apparent success, and I demurred with practiced humility. I spoke of my supposed life in Europe, of my investment philosophies, painting a portrait of Isabella Rossi as a woman of immense resources and impeccable taste, but revealing nothing personal, nothing real. I let them believe they were in control, that they were charming the wealthy outsider. I watched them, studied them. The judge's paternalistic condescension, Caroline's barely veiled avarice, and Daniel's discomfort, his eyes constantly darting toward his father for cues, a golden retriever who had long ago forgotten how to be anything but obedient. Once the main courses were served, I made my first move. I turned to Caroline, my expression one of sincere admiration. I must congratulate you on the Harrison Center, Caroline. It's a truly bold statement. She preened, a small, self satisfied smile playing on her lips. It's the future of Havenwood, she said. I tilted my head. Absolutely. To completely erase what came before, to make way for the new. It's a form of creative destruction, isn't it? So decisive. I understand there was a rather unfortunate fire that helped clear the way. A fortuitous tragedy, one might say. The word erase hung in the air. Caroline's smile tightened at the edges. It was a terrible accident, she said, her voice a little too sharp. Of course, I replied, my tone smooth as silk. A terrible, convenient accident. Before she could respond, I pivoted to the judge. Speaking of which, Judge, I imagine a town like this, with so much rapid development, must present unique legal challenges. Maintaining integrity, ensuring everything is done by the book. He nodded, falling into his familiar role as the sage patriarch. Integrity is the bedrock of this community, Miss Rossi. I took a slow sip of my wine. I'm so glad to hear you say that. In my line of work, due diligence is everything. I once backed out of a $1 billion merger because my team discovered a tiny, overlooked zoning irregularity from years prior. A buried mistake. It's astonishing, isn't it? How the smallest loose end can unravel the most magnificent tapestry if only the right person finds it and begins to pull. The judge's fork stilled halfway to his mouth. His eyes, for the first time, lost their patronizing warmth and turned hard and watchful. I was no longer just a wealthy woman, I was a potential threat. And then it was time for the main event. I turned living right here among us. I let the flattery settle before I delivered the blow. I was so moved when I read the old accounts of the bakery fire. To run into a burning building, to pull your own fiancé from the flames, it's the stuff of movies. I was narrating my own trauma back to its architect, my voice filled with a terrible, false sincerity. I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping. It must have been a private hell for you. To save her life only to watch her lose everything, her dream, her reputation, the town turning on her, whispering that she was to blame. It's a cruel irony. Daniel's face was ashen. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. It was a difficult time, he managed to stammer. I pressed on, my eyes holding his, refusing to let him look away. And then for her to just disappear, utterly vanish. I read that she was declared legally dead a year later, an unidentified victim of exposure, they said. To endure so much, to lose the woman you love in such a drawn out, tragic way, that kind of pain must leave a permanent scar on a man's soul. How does one ever truly recover from that? The air in the room was thick enough to choke on. Caroline was glaring at me, a silent, furious warning in her eyes. The judge was a statue carved from granite, his face unreadable but radiating a palpable menace. But Daniel was broken. The hero facade had shattered, and in its place was a pale, haunted man, cornered by a ghost he didn't recognize. We all did our best to move on, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I leaned back, my work done for the night. I raised my wine glass, the crystal ringing softly in the tense silence. Well, let us not dwell on the painful past, I said, my smile bright and dismissive. Let's toast to the future, to new partnerships, to Havenwood and to building that future on a foundation of unshakable truth and integrity. They drank the toast, but it felt like they were swallowing poison. The rest of the dinner was a stilted, awkward affair. Their confidence was gone, replaced by a frantic, confused suspicion. They left as soon as was politely possible, a family united not by love but by a sudden shared fear. I watched them go from my seat, a predator watching her wounded prey stumble back into the darkness. I sat alone for a long time, swirling the deep red wine in my glass, the sweet taste of deception. The mayor was beaming in the front row, and beside him, looking smug and confident, sat the Harrison family. After our dinner, they had been wary, but their greed was a more powerful force than their fear. They had spent the last week publicly championing my proposed project, positioning themselves as my natural partners. They believed they had weathered the storm of my strange questions and were now poised to claim their prize. They thought they were attending a coronation. They had no idea they were about to witness an execution. I walked onto the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause. I was the image of benevolent power, dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue dress. I smiled, a calm, practiced expression that betrayed none of the furious storm raging within me. I stepped up to the podium and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, people of Havenwood, I began, my voice the smooth, cultured voice of Isabella Rossi filling the auditorium. It has been a privilege to spend time in your beautiful town. A town is more than just buildings and streets. It is a story, a living history written by the people who call it home. The purpose of this fund is to honor that story, to ensure that Havenwood's future is built upon a foundation of its most cherished values: community, integrity, and above all, honesty. I saw the judge nod sagely in the front row, completely oblivious to the irony. Caroline shot him a triumphant smirk. The trap was set. I have reviewed all the wonderful proposals, I continued, but before I announce my decision, I feel compelled to share another story with you. A local story. A cautionary tale, perhaps. It's about a young baker who, not so long ago, poured her heart and soul into a small shop right here on Main Street. As I spoke, The large projector screen behind me, which was supposed to be displaying architectural renderings, flickered to life. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a large, vibrant photograph of the Rolling Pin Bakery, bustling with customers on a sunny morning. A collective murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. I saw Daniel flinch, his eyes glued to the image of a life he had helped obliterate. My voice began to lose its gentle, philanthropic tone, taking on a harder, more focused edge. This baker loved her town. She believed in its story. But her dream stood in the way of a different story, one of greed and ruthless ambition. So one night, her dream was turned to ash. This was not an accident, I declared, my voice ringing with authority. It was arson, a crime that was deliberately and systematically covered up. The screen changed again, displaying a timeline. It showed Caroline Harrison's final rejected offer for my property, dated 1 week before the fire. It showed bank records from a Harrison-owned shell corporation detailing a large, untraceable cash withdrawal made 2 days before the fire. Then a scanned, notarized document filled the screen. This is a sworn affidavit from your former fire chief, Frank Peterson, a man of unimpeachable integrity, detailing his discovery of the accelerant and the immense pressure he received from influential parties to abandon his inquiry. I finally allowed my gaze to fall directly on the Harrisons. They were no longer smug. They were trapped, pinned like insects under the harsh glare of the stage lights and the hundreds of eyes now turning toward them. The judge's face was a mask of cold fury. Caroline looked like she was going to be sick. Daniel was ghostly white, his knuckles gripping the armrests of his chair. "Why?" I asked, my voice dropping, pulling the entire room into the charged silence. Why would a family with everything do something so monstrous to a young woman who had nothing? I let the question hang in the air, a public indictment. I turned back to the audience, to the town I had once called home. They did it because she was in their way. So they decided to erase her. They burned her life's work, they assassinated her character, and then they left her for dead. I slowly, deliberately raised my hands into the spotlight, turning them over so the web of faint silvery scars on my skin was visible to everyone. But they made one critical mistake, I said, and now the smooth accent of Isabella Rossi began to fray, the raw, familiar cadence of my own voice breaking through. They didn't make sure the job was finished. I took a deep, shuddering breath, a breath I had been holding for 5 long years. My name is not Isabella Rossi. The confusion on the faces in the crowd was palpable. I looked directly at Daniel, at the man who had held me and lied to me, and I delivered the final, devastating blow. My name is Amelia Reyes, and I have come home. A tidal wave of shock washed over the auditorium. People were standing up, whispering frantically, pointing from me to the Harrisons. But I wasn't finished. As the chaos began to erupt, I held up a hand for silence. "I know this is a shocking claim," I called out, my voice clear and strong. "You might ask for proof. How could I possibly know the depths of their conspiracy, the words they spoke behind the locked doors of their mansion?" On the screen, a simple audio file appeared. A play button hovered over a sound wave. "You don't have to take my word for it," I said, my thumb hovering over the remote in my hand. "Why don't you listen to them yourselves?" I pressed the button, and from the auditorium's speakers, crystal clear in the stunned silence, came the sound of their voices from that fateful night. Caroline's triumph, Eleanor's praise, the judge's proud toast to a necessary sacrifice, and worst of all, Daniel's cold, hollow laugh, followed by the words that had haunted my every waking moment for 5 years, "A small price to pay." The recording ended, and in the abyss of total deafening silence that followed, the Harrison family's world came to an end. They were exposed, condemned by their own words in front of the very town they had fooled for generations. I stood on that stage, not as a victim, not as a ghost, but as a reckoning. Their judgment day had arrived. The silence that followed the recording was a living entity. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and energy out of the room, holding 1,000 people in a state of suspended, horrified disbelief. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the auditorium's speakers. Then the silence shattered. It wasn't a gradual return to noise, it was an explosion, a collective gasp, followed by a roar of outrage, a tidal wave of emotion that crashed directly onto the three people sitting in the front row. Camera flashes strobed like lightning, capturing the exact moment the Harrison dynasty died. I watched them from the stage, a detached observer of their personal apocalypse. Judge Harrison, the man whose gaze had once terrified me, looked small and frail, his face a ghastly shade of grey. His mask of judicial authority had crumbled, revealing the panicked, withered old man beneath. Eleanor had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for me or for justice, but for the utter annihilation of her social standing. And Caroline, the architect of my ruin, was frozen, her face a grotesque sculpture of disbelief and fury. They were no longer the rulers of this town, they were inmates in a prison of their own making, and the entire town had just become their jury. The first voice to cut through the cacophony was not from a person of authority, but from the heart of the town itself. It was Mr. Henderson, the elderly owner of the hardware store, a man who had known the judge for 50 years. He stood up, his body trembling with a righteous fury. "Is this true, William?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Did you do this? All these years, everything you stood for, was it all just a lie?" That single question opened the floodgates. The town turned on them. People were on their feet, yelling, pointing, weeping. It wasn't just about my bakery anymore. It was about every zoning variance the judge had ever approved, every case he had ever presided over, every condescending smile Eleanor had ever given at a charity event. It was the sudden, violent realization that the sheriff and two of his deputies, their faces grim, moved from the back of the room. Not towards me, but towards the Harrisons. Their mission was no longer to protect the town's most powerful family, but to protect them from the town itself. They formed a human shield, attempting to escort the judge, Eleanor, and Caroline through the swarming, furious crowd. "Thieves!" someone screamed. "Monsters!" shouted another. Their reign, their carefully crafted legacy of respect and power, was being dismantled and shredded in a matter of minutes. But as his parents and sister were being forced through the gauntlet of their former subjects, Daniel didn't move. He sat paralyzed, his head in his hands, his body racked with tremors. Then, as a deputy tried to pull him to his feet, he broke away. He stumbled forward, past the sheriff's restraining arm, past the chaos, and stopped at the foot of the stage. He looked up at me, and the entire hall seemed to fall silent again, all eyes turning to this final personal confrontation. The man standing before me was not the cold, confident conspirator from my nightmares. He was a shattered, weeping wreck. His face was streaked with tears, his body hunched over, as if from a physical blow. "She's telling the truth," he choked out, his voice so broken it was almost a whisper, yet it carried through the silent hall. He wasn't just speaking to me, he was confessing to the world. All of it, every word, is true. He sank to his knees, his hands clasped in front of him, not in prayer, but in a gesture of complete and utter surrender. "I was weak," he sobbed, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of guilt. "I was a coward. They told me it was the only way, that it was for the good of the family, and I chose them. I chose the money and the power and the lie over her. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, swimming with a genuine, soul deep agony I never thought him capable of feeling. The guilt. Amelia, the guilt has been a living hell. Every day for 5 years, I didn't just let them do it, I helped. I helped them, and I lied to you, and I broke you. He was no longer addressing the crowd. He was speaking only to me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I am so, so sorry. I loved you, and I destroyed you. A profound and aching sadness washed over me. The fiery rage that had fueled me for 5 years finally flickered and died, extinguished by the sight of his complete and total devastation. This was not the satisfying moment of triumph I had imagined. A protective hand on my shoulder. Her presence was a silent declaration. This woman is not alone anymore. Below us, the sheriff gently placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel didn't resist. He rose to his feet and allowed himself to be led away, his surrender absolute. And then the town turned to me. One by one, people began to approach the stage. Mrs. Gable, her eyes full of tears. Amelia, child, we are so sorry, she whispered, reaching out to touch my arm. We judged you. We believed them. Can you ever forgive us? The town that had cast me out was now welcoming me back, not as a hero, but as one of their own who they had grievously wronged. Their apologies were a balm on a wound I didn't know was still so raw. I had returned seeking retribution, but what I was being offered, unexpectedly, was redemption, both mine and theirs. The empire had fallen. The truth was free. But as I looked out at the emotional, fractured community, I knew the story wasn't over. The real question, the one that truly mattered, was what we would all choose to build on top of the ruins. The months that followed the town hall meeting were a strange, quiet purgatory for Havenwood. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage and revelation. The name Harrison, once a symbol of power and prestige, was now a muttered curse, a synonym for disgrace. The initial shock and anger of the townspeople had settled into a kind of sober melancholy. They were a community forced to look in the mirror and confront the uncomfortable truth of their own willful blindness. But beneath the sadness, there was something else, a fragile, tentative hope. The town had been broken open, but now, for the first time in a generation, it was free. The law, once the judge's personal instrument, moved with a swift and impartial force. The evidence I had presented was irrefutable. Judge William Harrison was disbarred, and along with a stoic Eleanor and a perpetually terrified Caroline, faced a mountain of federal and state charges ranging from conspiracy and insurance fraud to witness tampering. Their assets were frozen, their empire dismantled, piece by piece, by the very system they had once manipulated. Daniel, true to his confession, cooperated fully with the authorities. His testimony, delivered without excuse or evasion, painted a damning portrait of his family's cold blooded ambition. For his cooperation, he received a lighter sentence than the others. The obsessive need for revenge had been satisfied, and I found the victory to be profoundly empty. Tearing them down hadn't healed me, it had simply cleared the board. The question that remained was what game I wanted to play now. A week later, I called a second town hall meeting. The atmosphere was different this time, no longer charged with anger, but with a quiet, anxious curiosity. I stood on the same stage, but I was no longer Isabella the Avenger or Amelia the victim. I was just myself. I announced that Rossi Capital had acquired the Harrison Center and all of the surrounding properties. The family had bought up on Main Street. A nervous murmur went through the crowd. They feared one tyrant being replaced by another. I quickly put their fears to rest. This isn't my street, I announced, my voice clear and steady. It's ours, and we are going to build its future together. The project that followed was not one of demolition, but of restoration. We didn't tear down the soul of the town, we invested in it. The empty Harrison Center was renamed the Havenwood Collective. Instead of luxury condos, we built affordable apartments for teachers, nurses, and young families. The ground floor, where the soulless bank had been, became a small business incubator. I used the power of the Future Fund to offer low interest loans and mentorship to local entrepreneurs, the very people the Harrisons had tried to push out. A bookstore opened, then a family run diner, then a small art gallery. The soul of Main Street was slowly, carefully being breathed back into life. And at the heart of it all, in its rightful place at the corner of Main and Elm, I rebuilt the rolling pin. It was bigger this time, with large windows that flooded the space with light, and a state of the art teaching kitchen in the back. The scent of fresh bread and cinnamon once again became the town's morning perfume. And I found that the joy I had thought was lost forever was still there, waiting for me. Kneading dough, feeling it come to life under my palms, was no longer just a job. It was a meditation, a form of healing. My hands, with their silvery map of scars, were whole again. One day a letter arrived. The postmark was from a state correctional facility. It was from Daniel. It was a long, rambling, and deeply painful letter, filled with the kind of raw remorse that cannot be faked. He didn't ask for forgiveness or pity. He just wanted me to know that he was using his time to confront the man he had been, and that his greatest punishment was the sense of community that had been reborn. We sat in the new bakery, and she watched me show a young girl how to braid a challah. You could have owned this whole town, Amelia, she said quietly. You had the power to become just like them. I smiled and dusted the flour from my hands. You taught me how to be a queen, Evelyn, I told her. But I learned on my own that a true ruler doesn't seek to conquer a kingdom. She builds one. I now understand that revenge is a fire that burns the person who wields it just as much as their target. The real victory wasn't in watching the Harrisons fall, it was in finding the strength to rise myself and to bring an entire community up with me. The fire was meant to be my end, but it became my crucible. It burned away the naive girl I was and forged the woman I am. A woman who knows the difference between justice and vengeance, between power and strength. My life's recipe is different now. It accepts that some ingredients will be bitter, that you will get burned, that some things will be lost, but it knows that the most important step is to have the resilience to begin again and the grace to share the bread you bake with the world. Have you ever had to test someone's loyalty in your life? What did you learn from that experience? Share your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to hear more real life lessons that might change your perspective. Remember to share this video with someone who might need to hear that their worth is not determined by what they can give to others. Thank you for listening, and may you find the clarity to recognize the true relationships in your own life.